Hello and welcome. On the edge of two worlds, where one continent reaches toward another across a narrow strip of water, there is a city that has been besieged more times than almost any other place on Earth. Coveted by generals and emperors, by desert conquerors and steppe warriors, by crusaders and caliphs and kings who had never even seen its walls. For over 1,000 years, it stood as the most desired prize in the known world, and yet for much of that time, it held. The city was Constantinople, and the question of why so many people wanted it so desperately is one of the most fascinating puzzles in all of history. Before we go further, a small request. If you're comfortable doing so, leave a comment and let us know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people are settling into this story from all corners of the world at all different hours. It makes the history feel a little more alive. Now back to the city. What made Constantinople so extraordinary was not any single thing. It was the convergence, geography and wealth, faith and ambition, the idea that whoever held this place held something more than walls and harbours and markets. They held a claim on the world itself. The city sat at the crossing point between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between the ancient Greek world and the rising force of Rome. To control it was to control the flow of trade, the movement of armies, the pulse of commerce across half the known world. But Constantinople was never only about commerce or strategy. It became something harder to measure, a symbol, the seat of an empire that called itself the continuation of Rome, the guardian of a Christian faith that stretched across continents, a living monument to the idea that civilization had a home, and that home had an address. Over the course of this story, we will move through the centuries that shaped the city and threatened it. We will look at the geography that made its location so remarkable, the walls that seemed almost supernatural in their endurance, the wealth and ceremony that made its rulers feel touched by something divine. We will follow the waves of armies that came to take it, from the earliest Arab sieges to the Crusader betrayal, from the Bulgarian wars to the final assault that changed the world. It is a long story, a rich one, and it begins, as so many great stories do, with a question of place. There is a narrow channel of water that cuts between two continents. It is only about half a mile wide at its tightest point. A strong swimmer might look across it and believe for a moment that the other shore was almost within reach. But that strip of water, the Bosporus, is one of the most consequential stretches of sea on Earth. It is the only passage between the Black Sea to the north and the Sea of Marmara to the south, and through Marmara onward to the Aegean, to the Mediterranean, to the wider world. Everything that moved between those bodies of water had to pass through here. Every grain ship, every merchant vessel, heavy with silk or salt or timber, every warship searching for an advantage. There was no other way through. Now imagine a triangular peninsula of land sitting right where the Bosporus meets the Sea of Marmara. On one side, the strait itself, with its powerful currents. On another, a deep natural harbour so sheltered and so perfectly formed that sailors gave it a name that tells you everything you need to know. They called it the Golden Horn. On the third side, open water stretching south. 3 sides of this triangle are defined by sea. Only the western edge connects the peninsula to the mainland. And that edge, that single overland approach, is where any attacker would have to come. Even before a single wall was built, before any emperor had looked out across these waters and imagined an empire, the location was remarkable. It almost feels designed. A place where geography itself seems to have worked toward a purpose. The Greeks recognized it. A city called Byzantium stood on this peninsula centuries before it became anything more than a regional port. Ancient sources suggest it was founded by Greek colonists sometime in the 7th century, before the Common Era, though the precise dates remain a matter of scholarly discussion. What is not in doubt is why they chose the spot. The fishing was extraordinary. The harbour was among the finest in the known world, and the position, sitting at the crossroads of overland and maritime routes, made it a natural hub for trade, moving between the Black Sea communities to the north and the Greek cities of the Aegean to the south. The Black Sea was not simply another body of water. For the ancient Greek world, it was a kind of northern horizon, a vast and somewhat mysterious expanse that nonetheless yielded enormous value. Grain came down from its northern shores, from the fertile lands around what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. Fish arrived in quantities that could feed entire cities. Timber flowed south. Slaves and furs and raw materials moved along routes that eventually funneled through this narrow channel of water. Whoever sat at the mouth of that funnel collected tolls, controlled access, dictated terms. The commercial logic was almost inescapable. But the strategic logic ran even deeper than commerce. This was also one of the few places in the ancient world where land routes from Europe and Asia came into proximity across water narrow enough to be bridged or crossed by boat. Armies moving between continents had to reckon with this strait. Persian kings had crossed it. Alexander's forces had passed this way. The Bosporus was not merely a waterway. It was a hinge on which the movement of power between two worlds swung back and forth across the centuries. There is something almost strange about standing at a place like this and trying to see it fresh. We know what it became. We know the enormous weight of history that would eventually press down on this peninsula. But try for a moment to imagine it before all of that. A rocky headland above two seas. The smell of salt water and the sound of currents. Ships passing in both directions. A modest city of Greek character, neither obscure nor world-famous, but quietly essential in the way that certain crossroads places always are. Important enough to fight over, not yet important enough to dream about. That would change. What the site offered was not simply advantage on any one dimension. It was the rare convergence of multiple advantages arriving together in a single place. A natural harbour of exceptional quality. A peninsula that water protected on most sides, reducing the perimeter any defender needed to hold. A position dominating the only maritime connection between two inland seas. And a location where overland routes from both Europe and Asia arrived at the water's edge and looked across at each other. Geography, in a sense, had been quietly preparing this place for centuries before history arrived to make use of it. The peninsula did not need walls to be defensible. It did not need wealth to be valuable. It did not need an empire to be coveted. Those things would come, and they would transform what was already there into something the ancient founders of Byzantium could never have quite imagined. But the foundation was always the land itself, and the water surrounding it, and the fact that anyone who wished to move between the two great seas of the known world had no choice but to pass within sight of this shore. That was the inheritance Constantinople received before a single stone of its famous walls had been laid. And it is the reason that long before any emperor looked at this place and decided to make it the centre of the world had already been quietly arranging itself around it. Long before an emperor arrived to remake it, Byzantium was already a city of some standing. It was not one of the great metropolises of the ancient world. It did not rival Alexandria or Antioch or Rome itself in size or cultural prestige. But it had something those cities lacked, which was that particular geographical gift the peninsula offered, and over the centuries it had made use of it. Greek in character, commercially active, sitting astride the trading routes that ran between the Black Sea and the Aegean, Byzantium had a quality that quieter cities sometimes develop across long years of steady importance. It knew its own value. It had also known conflict. The city changed hands more than once, was besieged, damaged, sometimes punished for backing the wrong side in a wider struggle. Rome had eventually absorbed it, as Rome absorbed most things that mattered in that part of the world. And for a time Byzantium continued as it always had, a prosperous provincial city of the Roman Empire, useful and well positioned, but not a place where the fate of civilization seemed to hang in the balance. Not yet. What changed everything was not a battle or a discovery, but a decision, and the man who made it was Constantine. By the early 4th century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire faced pressures that the old political geography was struggling to accommodate. Rome itself, magnificent and storied, sat in the Italian peninsula, positioned comfortably enough for an earlier age when the Mediterranean was the heart of Roman concern. But the empire had grown enormously since then, and its most urgent frontiers were now elsewhere. The Danube to the north, where pressure from migrating peoples was constant. The Persian frontier to the east, where a revived and ambitious empire demanded serious military attention. The eastern provinces, too, were among the wealthiest in the Roman world. Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, these were not peripheral territories. They were, in many ways, the beating economic heart of the empire. Rome was not the wrong city for a Roman world. It was perhaps the wrong city for this Roman world. The distances were difficult. Emperors who needed to respond quickly to crises in the east found themselves moving through enormous stretches of territory that communication and supply chains could barely keep up with. The idea of a second centre, an eastern anchor for imperial authority, had already occurred to various rulers before Constantine, but no one had acted on it with quite his combination of ambition and resources. Constantine chose Byzantium. There is some scholarly debate about precisely how calculated the decision was, and whether the choice emerged gradually or was arrived at more suddenly. What is not in doubt is that he committed to it fully. Work began on a scale that would have been remarkable anywhere. The city was not merely expanded, it was reconceived. Streets were laid out and buildings ordered according to the logic of a capital. Forums were constructed, the open ceremonial spaces that Roman civic life required. A hippodrome was enlarged until it could accommodate tens of thousands of spectators. Palaces rose to house the emperor and his court. Porticoed colonnades lined the main avenues. Statues arrived from across the empire, some looted from older sanctuaries, repurposed to fill and decorate this new centre of power. There is something worth pausing on here. Constantine was not simply solving an administrative problem by moving the imperial centre eastward. He was making a statement about where the future lay. Every palace built, every column erected, every shipment of marble arriving at the harbour carried a message. This place matters. This is where power lives. And in the ancient world, where power chose to live, had a way of reshaping everything around it. The city was formally dedicated in the year 330. It was given a new name, or at least a new way of being spoken of, the city of Constantinople. The old name Byzantium did not vanish entirely from use or memory, but something had shifted. The city that Greeks had founded as a useful commercial port now carried the name of an emperor on its shoulders, and with that name came an entirely different kind of weight, because the capital was not merely where the government sat, it was where legitimacy itself was seen to reside. To control the capital was to claim the centre of the Roman order, to be crowned there, to issue edicts from there, to be buried in the great churches that were beginning to rise across its hills. These things meant something that no other city could quite replicate. The geography had always made the peninsula valuable, but imperial investment made it something more. It made it a symbol. Power attracts attention. Symbols attract desire. And a city that was both the key to the strait between two seas and the sacred heart of a vast empire would never again be simply a place people passed through. It would be a place people dreamed of possessing, a prize whose value was not only strategic or commercial, but almost mythological. The transformation had begun, and the city would never be ordinary again. To become the capital of an empire was one thing. To remain it, surrounded by jealous rivals and shifting frontiers, was another. Constantinople was not just dressed in marble and crowned with palaces, it was armoured. Step back, in your mind, from the colonnades and the forums, and look instead at the line where the city meets the land. There, across the neck of the peninsula, the Romans and then the Byzantines built one of the most formidable defensive systems the pre-modern world ever knew. The land walls, often called the Theodosian walls, after the emperor under whom their great expansion took shape in the early 5th century. They were not a single wall, but a system. Imagine not a simple barrier, but layers. First, a broad ditch which in times of siege could be flooded, turning the approach into a muddy, uncertain killing ground. Behind it, a low outer wall with its own walkway and towers. Then a space, a terrace where defenders could move troops and supplies quickly. And finally, rising behind all of this, the main wall itself, thick and high, studded with massive towers at regular intervals, each one a raised platform from which to watch, to signal, and when necessary, to fight. The numbers that survive in the sources and in modern measurements can feel almost abstract. A wall line stretching for several kilometres across the landward side. Towers every few dozen metres. Curtain walls several metres thick. But the effect for anyone approaching with hostile intent would have been immediate and sobering. What lay ahead was not a city that had simply grown a wall as an afterthought, but a capital that had been deliberately wrapped in stone. These fortifications did not emerge fully formed in a single moment. Earlier defences had already existed under Constantine and his predecessors. As the population grew and suburbs spilled outward, new walls were thrown up. The Theodosian system represented a conscious decision to push the defensive line further into the countryside, and to do so in a way that acknowledged new realities of warfare. The increasing use of heavy siege equipment, the vulnerability of single walls to undermining or concentrated assault, the need for depth rather than just height. There was a psychological dimension as well. For the inhabitants of Constantinople, the land walls were not only military structures, they were borders of the imagination. Inside them lay the ordered space of the city, the rhythm of markets and ceremonies and daily life. Outside stretched the less predictable world of fields, villages, and armies on the move. When rumours of invasion spread, people knew instinctively what to do. They poured inside the walls, livestock driven in, grain stores moved, gates barred. The walls turned the peninsula into a kind of controlled island. Yet stone alone did not make Constantinople so hard to take. Its greatest ally was water. On 3 sides the city touched the sea, the wide open Marmara to the south, the narrower, busier Bosphorus to the east, and the sheltered inlet of the Golden Horn curving like a crooked finger along the north. Each of these bodies of water played a different defensive role. The Marmara's long shoreline was not entirely without landing points, but steep banks and currents made large-scale amphibious assaults difficult. The Bosphorus, with its swift waters and shifting winds, was a challenge for fleets that did not know it well, and the Golden Horn, calm and protected, became both the city's safest harbour and one of its most carefully controlled thresholds. Harbours are double-edged things. They bring ships, and with ships come food, wealth, news and pilgrims. But ships can also bring enemies. Constantinople's answer to this problem was to turn its waters into tools. Along the Golden Horn, walls ran above the quays, so that even if ships anchored peacefully beneath them, the city still looked down, secure behind its stone ridge. And at the mouth of the harbour, stretched from the city side to the opposite bank, the Byzantines employed one of the most famous and evocative devices in medieval military history, a great chain drawn across the water. This was not a delicate ornament, but a massive iron barrier, slung on floating supports or anchored to pontoons, raised or lowered as needed. In time of peace it might rest or be partially opened to allow controlled traffic. In time of danger it was hauled up, turning the mouth of the Golden Horn into a locked door. A hostile fleet could not simply sail in and anchor under the walls of the city's northern side. It had to reckon with the chain, with currents, and with whatever ships the defenders chose to send against it. Because Constantinople did not rely on passive defences alone. It had a navy sometimes strong, sometimes weakened by neglect or misfortune, but always imagined as part of its defensive architecture. Ships patrolled, intercepted, and when needed, rammed and burned enemy vessels that ventured too close. The line between wall and fleet blurred. Tower tops communicated with masts, signals flashed from land to sea. Taken together, the picture that emerges is of a city that turned its geography into an ally. High ground crowned by fortifications, sea lanes commanded by harbours and chains, layers of defence on land and water that forced any would-be conqueror to solve multiple problems at once. For an attacking army, the apparent choices were straightforward. One could try to storm the land walls, one could attempt an amphibious assault, or one could lay siege and try to starve the city into submission. None of these options was simple. Storming the Theodosian walls meant bringing up siege towers, rams, ladders, perhaps even early forms of artillery, but the approach ground was narrow. The defenders, operating from secure positions and with interior lines of communication, could rush reinforcements along the wall tops to wherever the pressure was greatest. Archers and artillery on the towers had clear fields of fire across the ditch and the outer works. Even if assault troops managed to take an outer wall, they might find themselves trapped in the deadly space between that and the inner defences, under constant attack from above. Attempting to come by sea had its own difficulties. Ships must be built, supplied, and coordinated. Weather could scatter fleets, currents could drag them off course, and even if attackers managed to land men on one of the more accessible shores, they would confront walls that, though perhaps not as monumental as the landward defences, were still formidable, often rising directly above steep rocky banks or defended by their own towers and batteries. Starving the city seemed, from a distance, like the most reliable strategy. Shut the gates, surround the walls, and wait. Yet Constantinople's dockyards and warehouses were designed with this possibility in mind. The city maintained granaries, cisterns, and storehouses large enough to sustain a substantial population for long periods. As long as some sea lanes remained open and the imperial government could muster even a modest fleet, supplies could trickle in under naval escort. Besiegers, on the other hand, had to feed their armies in the field, often far from their own bases, dependent on foraging or long and vulnerable supply lines. The logistics tilted the balance. To keep an army assembled for months, let alone years, demanded enormous resources and discipline. Disease, boredom, and the grinding strain of maintaining camps and siege works all ate away at morale. The defenders, sheltered and supplied, could rotate units, repair walls between assaults, and conduct sorties at times of their choosing. From a distance, and across the longer arc of its history, Constantinople can look almost untouchable. Generation after generation of would-be conquerors pitched their tents before its walls, and most of them went away again with little to show for it. Chroniclers, impressed by this record, sometimes spoke of the city as if it were protected by destiny or by divine favour, as much as by stone and sea. But inside the walls, the experience was very different. The same structures that symbolised security also reminded the inhabitants how precarious their position really was. You do not build 3 lines of walls, stud them with towers, gird your harbour with chains, and maintain fleets on constant alert unless you expect danger. The city's magnificence coexisted with a constant background knowledge that it was, in some ways, a fortress under siege, even in quieter years, ringed not only by water and masonry, but by the potential hostility of the world beyond. This tension between apparent invincibility and ever-present threat would shape the city's character. Ceremonies, processions, and the rhythms of imperial life took place in the shadow of battlements. Trade and worship flourished within a space that could, at any moment, be cut off and forced to stand alone. And as the centuries turned, the walls and waters of Constantinople would be tested again and again, in an age of sieges that would make the city's reputation and haunt its sleep. If the walls and waters of Constantinople made it a fortress, what lay behind them made it something else entirely, a machine for gathering, concentrating, and displaying wealth. The city did not simply happen to be rich. It was designed to be the place where money, goods, and obligations flowed together. In the Roman world, and in the Byzantine one that followed, taxation was less a matter of coins changing hands, and more a system of moving resources, grain from Egypt and later from Thrace and Anatolia, oil and wine from the Aegean, flocks and herds from the Balkans and the Highlands. Much of this over time found its way to the capital. Think of Constantinople as the hub of a wheel. Out on the spokes were provinces, estates, villages, monasteries and towns, each owing something to the state: harvests, animals, labour, and sometimes hard cash. Caravans and ships carried these obligations inward to imperial storehouses and treasuries. From there, the flow reversed: salaries for soldiers and bureaucrats, rations for the urban poor, gifts to foreign envoys and church leaders, payments to craftsmen and builders, all radiated outward again. The city's government worked in part by controlling this movement. To pay an army on a distant frontier, the emperor did not simply send gold. He might send a letter that allowed certain taxes to be collected in coin instead of kind, or instructed provincial officials to draw from grain reserves in state granaries. But the centre, the place where orders were written, accounts balanced, and records kept, was Constantinople. To control it was to stand where all these lines of obligation crossed. Around this administrative core grew the more visible world of markets and trade. The city's natural and artificial harbours received ships from many directions. From the Black Sea came grain, fish, wax, honey, and slaves. From the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean arrived wine, oil, timber, and manufactured goods. From further afield, often passed on through intermediaries, came silk from the east, spices from India, furs and amber from the forests and shores of the far north. Much of this did not stay long. Constantinople was both a consumer and a broker. Merchants offloaded cargoes into the city's warehouses, paid duties, bought and sold in bulk, and then loaded again onto other ships. Some goods went inland, up river valleys and across mountain passes. Others were broken into smaller lots and sold in the city's own markets, filtering down from wholesale traders to shopkeepers, from them to customers. For a visitor from a provincial town, the experience of these markets would have been overwhelming. Long colonnaded streets lined with workshops. The sharp sounds of metal on metal from smithies. The softer, repetitive strokes of looms. The smell of tanned leather, drying fish and baking bread. Stalls piled with cloth dyed in colours that ordinary people could rarely afford. Imported ceramics, glassware that caught and fractured the light. In quiet corners, money changers weighed coins from distant lands, scraping off tiny shavings of precious metal to test their purity. There were specialised quarters too, areas where silks were woven and embroidered. Districts known for goldsmiths and jewellers, where tiny workshops turned imported bullion and gems into court regalia, reliquaries and jewellery. Shipyards and rope walks along the waterfront. Bakeries that supplied not just neighbours, but large segments of the city's population. Behind this daily commerce stood the state. Many warehouses belonged to the government, not private merchants. Certain trades operated under imperial regulations or monopolies. In some periods, silk in particular was closely guarded, its production supervised so that the finest grades went directly to the palace. The emperor's officials could requisition goods, fix prices, or grant special privileges. Constantinople's markets were lively places of private profit, but they were also instruments of public power. This combination of economic gravity and political control made the city profoundly attractive. If you were an ambitious general, a powerful courtier, or a provincial governor, Constantinople represented more than a large collection of people behind formidable walls. It was where your own position could be secured with stipends, titles, and gifts drawn from this enormous reservoir of wealth. If you were a foreign ruler, the city was a treasury that, if captured or compelled to pay, could bankroll your own ambitions for years. The Byzantines understood that wealth on such a scale was not only to be counted, it was also to be seen. Life at the imperial court became, over the centuries, a carefully choreographed theatre of magnificence. The palace complex, sprawling over a promontory above the sea, was not a single building, but a small city of halls, chapels, courtyards, and gardens. Inside, ceremony turned raw resources into symbols. On certain days, ambassadors from distant lands were led through a sequence of spaces, each more impressive than the last. They might pass through halls lined with marble and porphyry, stone taken from quarries that the Romans had once reserved for imperial use alone. They would see walls inlaid with gold and coloured glass, floors set with intricate mosaics, and curtains of heavy, patterned silk hanging in doorways. Throne rooms were arranged so that the emperor, when he appeared, seemed framed by shimmering surfaces and bathed in reflected light. Later accounts, especially from astonished visitors, speak of mechanical marvels, metal birds that sang, lions that roared beside the throne, seats that rose and fell. How much of this is exact description and how much is exaggeration is difficult to say. But what matters is not the engineering details, it is the effect such stories convey. The court was supposed to feel otherworldly, beyond the ordinary. To stand in the presence of the Emperor of Constantinople was to be reminded, in every direction one looked, of the scale of the government he embodied. These displays were not confined to enclosed halls. Processions wound through the city, linking the palace to the great church of Hagia Sophia, to other sanctuaries, to public spaces like the Hippodrome. On feast days and after military victories, the emperor rode or walked along routes lined with crowds. Relics of saints were carried in ornate containers. Banners glinted with gold thread. Soldiers in polished armour marched in formation, their weapons catching the light. On some occasions, captives or seized treasures from conquered lands were paraded, a moving catalogue of the empire's reach. For ordinary inhabitants, these moments did more than break the routine of daily work. They reinforced a sense that the city's prosperity and the emperor's image were entwined. The bread they bought, the jobs they held in state workshops or private enterprises, the security they felt behind the walls, all of these could be linked, in their minds, to the figure who presided over ceremonies and issued edicts from the palace. Wealth flowed in, wealth flowed out. The emperor, at the centre, directed the current and symbolised its purpose. This symbolic power mattered far beyond the walls. Neighbouring rulers watched Constantinople's rituals closely. To be recognised by the emperor, to receive a title, a robe, or even a carefully staged audience, could elevate a foreign prince in the eyes of his own subjects. Conversely, to be ignored, snubbed, or portrayed as a subordinate stung. The city, by combining economic might with ceremonial splendour, made itself not just the capital of a state, but an arbiter of rank in the wider region. Little wonder, then, that controlling Constantinople became an object of desire not only for distant invaders, but for men within the empire itself. Generals proclaimed by their troops, disgruntled members of the imperial family, powerful ministers with private followings, all knew that legitimacy in Byzantium was closely tied to possession of the capital. To rule from somewhere else with the court, the treasuries, and the great churches still in other hands felt incomplete. To enter Constantinople as master, to sit on its throne and process through its streets, was to make a claim not just to power, but to the entire aura that the city projected. Outside the empire, the same logic operated on a grander scale. For Arab caliphs, Bulgarian khans, Rus's princes, Seljuk, and later Ottoman sultans, Constantinople was more than a rich prize. It was a symbol. To take it would be to show that their own faith, their own people, their own vision of rule had eclipsed that of Rome's heirs. The city's warehouses and workshops promised practical riches. Its palaces, baths, and churches suggested comfort and prestige. But its greatest lure lay in what it meant to stand in its centre and be seen by the world as its lord. In this way, the very prosperity that sustained Constantinople also fed the ambitions of those who dreamed of possessing it. Every caravan that arrived, every ship that docked, every new church ornamented with gold and marble increased not only the city's security and splendour, but also the pressure gathering beyond its walls. Wealth nourished defences, defences protected wealth, and together they created an imperial image so compelling that generation after generation of rivals, near and far, decided that they must either be recognised by the city or one day replace its masters. All of this wealth and ceremony did something more than impress merchants and foreign envoys. Over time, it helped to wrap Constantinople in an aura that was not only political, but sacred. The city that Constantine had founded as a Christian capital did not begin as the unquestioned centre of the faith. In the early centuries, important Christian communities flourished in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Each had its own traditions, its own bishops, its own martyr stories and holy places. Constantinople, new and consciously constructed, had to invent its past. It did so, in part, by gathering holiness to itself. Churches rose across the city, many built on a generous scale. Some were modest parish buildings serving neighbourhoods. Others were vast foundations sponsored by emperors and wealthy elites. The greatest of them, rebuilt in its most famous form under Justinian in the 6th century, was Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Later visitors would speak of entering its immense interior and feeling that they had left the earth behind. For the people of Constantinople, it was more than an impressive building. It was a statement that this city, not Rome, not Alexandria, stood at the meeting point of empire and heaven. Other churches gave the city a network of sanctuaries, each with its own associations. There were shrines to the Virgin Mary, to popular warrior saints, to martyrs whose stories were retold in sermons and hymns. Monasteries clustered along the land walls, and in the suburbs, places of prayer and study, but also of influence, where monks could write, copy texts, and sometimes shape opinion. Into these buildings came relics, objects believed to be connected to Christ, the apostles, and later saints. Over the centuries, Constantinople accumulated a remarkable collection, fragments of the true cross said to be taken from the wood on which Christ was crucified, nails, thorns, pieces of the lance that pierced his side, the tunic of the Virgin, the head of John the Baptist, the bodies or body parts of hundreds of saints. Some of these acquisitions followed elaborate journeys, brought from distant provinces, purchased, traded, or presented as diplomatic gifts. Others arrived after wars, carried back as spoils or rescued, according to pious stories, from threatened regions. Whether every relic was what it was claimed to be is a question that has occupied skeptics and believers alike. What matters for understanding Constantinople is how people treated them. These objects were not kept as curiosities. They were housed in chapels and sanctuaries, wrapped in gold and silk, placed in jewelled containers. On certain days, they were carried in processions through the city's streets or set out for veneration. For many inhabitants and pilgrims, they were the closest one could come to the physical presence of the sacred in everyday life. The combination of great churches and famous relics made Constantinople a spiritual magnet. Pilgrims came not only from within the empire, but from lands beyond its borders. Armenians, Georgians, Slavs, Latin Christians from the West, all could be found at different times in the city's churches, lighting candles, attending liturgy, seeking healing or forgiveness. Guidebooks circulated, describing which shrines to visit, what miracles had occurred there, which relics were associated with which needs. As this religious landscape took shape, the Bishop of Constantinople, eventually titled the Patriarch, rose in prestige. Church councils in the 4th and 5th centuries, gatherings of bishops from across the Christian world, debated doctrine and discipline. In these meetings, Constantinople's representatives argued that because their city was now the seat of the emperor, its bishop should rank second only to the Bishop of Rome. Over time, this claim gained wide, if sometimes grudging, acceptance in the eastern provinces. The Patriarch of Constantinople became, in practice, the most influential churchman in the Eastern Roman Empire. Imperial and ecclesiastical power were closely intertwined. Emperors sponsored church-building projects, presided over councils, and sometimes intervened in doctrinal disputes. In return, patriarchs and prominent bishops blessed imperial policies, framed victories as signs of divine favour, and included the emperor in the language of their prayers. To be crowned in Hagia Sophia, anointed by the patriarch, was not just a political ceremony. It was a ritual that suggested God's approval of a particular ruler, a particular dynasty. This blending of faith and rule deepened the city's symbolic value. To many Byzantine writers, Constantinople was more than the capital of an empire. It was a new Jerusalem, a chosen city under special divine protection. Its survival through sieges and disasters could be interpreted as proof of this favour. When a crisis passed, sermons might credit the intercession of the Virgin or a particular saint. Icons were said to have wept or sweated, processions of relics to have turned back enemies or halted plagues. These stories, whether taken literally or metaphorically, helped people imagine their city as part of a sacred story, stretching from the Bible into their own time. Yet this religious status did not remove tension. It often sharpened it. Doctrinal disputes, especially in the early centuries, could become intensely political. Arguments over how to describe Christ's nature or how to depict him in art did not stay in scholarly treatises. They appeared in sermons, in graffiti, in whispered conversations, in the markets. When councils ruled one way or another, whole regions might bristle. Constantinople's defence of one formulation could alienate Egypt or Syria, leading to long-lasting estrangements. Within the city, emperors and patriarchs sometimes found themselves on opposite sides. During the iconoclast controversies of the 8th and 9th centuries, some rulers supported the removal or destruction of religious images, worrying that veneration of icons had become a kind of idolatry. Others, including many monks and lay believers, resisted fiercely, seeing icons as vital conduits of devotion. At times, icons were taken down, mosaics plastered over, relics hidden away. At others, they were triumphantly restored, carried in new processions that celebrated their return. Each shift left marks not only on walls and altars, but on memories and loyalties. There were also quieter, persistent frictions between Constantinople and other Christian centres. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, nurtured his own claims to primacy, rooted in the belief that he was the successor of the Apostle Peter. Differences over doctrine, practice, language, and authority accumulated. When envoys from Rome and Constantinople finally excommunicated each other in the 11th century in what later generations would call the Great Schism, it did not instantly sever all ties between Eastern and Western Christians, but it did formalize a long-growing division. From then on, Constantinople saw itself more clearly as the leading seat of what became known as Orthodox Christianity, distinct from the Latin West. From the outside, all of this made the city's religious standing both attractive and provocative. For rulers and peoples who shared the Orthodox faith, Constantinople was, in many ways, the model. Its liturgy, its chants, its church architecture, its way of painting icons, all spread outward, carried by missionaries, traders, and intermarriages. When the Prince of Kiev accepted baptism in the 10th century, adopting Christianity for his people, later chronicles would associate his decision with the beauty of the rites he had heard about in Constantinople's great church. Whether this is literal or crafted after the fact, it illustrates how the city's religious culture became a reference point. To be recognized there, to have one's church acknowledged by its patriarch, was a source of legitimacy. At the same time, the city's claim to spiritual leadership could be resented. Western European powers, especially as they grew stronger, viewed Constantinople with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. When crusading armies called eastward to fight in the Holy Land passed through the city, their leaders negotiated with emperors, swore oaths, and attended services in Hagia Sophia. Some were impressed by the splendour, others were unsettled by unfamiliar customs and disputed points of doctrine. Over time, these tensions could harden. By the early 13th century, when one crusading army diverted its mission and seized Constantinople itself, religious difference was one of several justifications offered. To those attackers and their supporters, the city was not only rich, it was a wayward Christian capital, whose possessions and churches could, in their view, be claimed or corrected. For Muslim powers, Constantinople occupied another place in the imagination. Early Arab poets and chroniclers described it as the stronghold of the Romans, a city of churches and relics, difficult to reach and harder to take. Some traditions within Islam came to speak of its eventual conquest as a notable, even blessed achievement, though the exact significance of such sayings has been interpreted in different ways by later scholars. In any case, the perception that Constantinople was the heart of a rival religious political order made it a compelling target. To plant a different banner on its walls would not only yield material rewards, it would send a message about whose faith, whose law, whose worldview now claimed the centre stage. In this way, Constantinople's Christian identity amplified everything else about it. The same walls and harbours that guarded its warehouses also sheltered relics that people believed could avert disaster. The same palaces that staged elaborate audiences for foreign ambassadors also hosted synods of bishops debating the nature of God. The same processions that displayed imperial power wove through streets lined with shrines and chapels, blending the language of earthly authority with the imagery of the divine. To desire the city, then, was rarely only to desire its gold, its granaries, or its strategic position. For believers and rivals alike, it was to reach for something more abstract. The right to say, our truth, our church, our God, stands at the centre of this world. Whether conquerors framed it as a sacred prize to be honoured, an errant capital to be disciplined, or a rival shrine to be eclipsed, they almost always saw in Constantinople not just a city of stone and water, but a stage on which religious and political dreams could be performed before a watching world. The belief that Constantinople stood under a kind of special protection was not only a matter of sermons and hymns. It was tested, again and again, in the most brutal way possible, by siege. From an early point in its history, the city became a magnet for attackers. The same walls and harbours that awed visiting pilgrims also drew the attention of ambitious rulers and restless steppe confederations. If a single army could force those gates, it might seize not just treasure, but a functioning imperial capital, a ready-made prize that could transform a regional leader into a world power. One of the first great tests came in the early 7th century, when the Eastern Roman Empire was straining under pressure on multiple fronts. To the north, along the Danube, steppe peoples had formed rising coalitions. Among them were the Avars, a confederation of mounted warriors who had already fought the empire and extracted subsidies. To the east, the long-standing rival Persian Empire had taken advantage of internal turmoil to push deep into imperial territory. By the 620s, the situation had grown desperate. Persian forces had reached as far as Chalcedon, just across the Bosporus, from Constantinople's own walls. At the same time, the Avars moved from the European side. Chroniclers describe the summer of 626 as a moment when the city faced enemies on both shores, with its emperor, Heraclius, away on campaign in the eastern provinces. Inside the capital, officials had to manage defense, supplies, and morale without the physical presence of their ruler. The Avars brought with them Slavic allies, and according to the sources, siege engines rolled up to the land walls. They attempted to coordinate with Persian forces across the water, hoping that a simultaneous assault might overwhelm the defenders. But here, Constantinople's geography and command of the sea began to tell. The Bosporus and the Golden Horn were not just pretty stretches of water. They were defensive moats that had to be crossed or neutralized. Byzantine ships, crewed by experienced sailors and marines, controlled these passages. They prevented the Persians from ferrying troops across to the European side and harassed any attempt to bridge the gap. Without the ability to concentrate their forces, the besiegers could not deliver a decisive blow. The defense of 626 became, in later memory, one of the city's foundational survival stories. Accounts speak of processions along the walls, of icons and relics carried to inspire courage, of hymns sung through the night. The Virgin Mary, in particular, was credited as a protector of the city. A hymn known as the Akathist, still used in Orthodox liturgy, became associated with this crisis. Whether every detail preserved in later retellings is exact or embellished is hard to say. What seems clear is that the blending of practical defence, walls, ships, archers, and spiritual imagery left a lasting impression. The siege failed. The Avars withdrew, the Persians could not cross, and within a few years Heraclius's campaigns would break the Persian threat. Constantinople had weathered a coordinated assault by two major enemies. In doing so, it sent a message across the region. This city was not easily taken. That message would be tested again in the following century under very different circumstances. In the 7th and 8th centuries, a new power emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. Early Muslim armies, united under the first caliphs, exploded outward with remarkable speed, defeating both Byzantine and Persian forces and taking control of Syria, Egypt, and much of the Near East. Cities that had once been spiritual and administrative siblings to Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, came under Muslim rule. In this new map, Constantinople stood as a fortified peninsula of the old order, projecting into a world that was rapidly changing. It was almost inevitable that the expanding Arab-Byzantine conflict would turn toward the imperial capital itself. The first major Arab siege of Constantinople is usually dated to the late 600s and 70s. Sources from both sides of the frontier describe a protracted campaign, though the exact length and sequence of events are debated by historians. An Arab fleet and army moved into the Aegean and the Sea of Marmara, establishing bases and attempting to choke off the city's supplies. If they could cut the sea routes and pressure the land approaches, they might bring starvation and surrender without having to scale the massive Theodosian walls. Again, technology and command of the sea proved decisive. By this time, the Byzantines had developed a new weapon, a combustible substance that later chroniclers called Greek fire. Its exact composition has been lost, perhaps deliberately guarded as a state secret, perhaps simply forgotten over centuries. Descriptions suggest a kind of liquid incendiary projected from siphon-like devices mounted on ships or city walls that could cling to surfaces and continue burning even on water. Arab fleets that ventured too close found themselves facing this terrifying innovation. At night, in narrow waters, the sight of streams of flame arcing toward wooden hulls would have been both tactically devastating and psychologically shattering. Stories of ships engulfed, of men leaping into the sea to escape fire that followed them, circulated far beyond the immediate battlefield. Greek fire did not operate alone. It was part of a broader naval system, Shipyards along the Golden Horn, trained crews, experienced admirals, and a logistical network that could provision fleets and repair damage. As long as Constantinople could receive grain and supplies by sea, from the Black Sea, from remaining Anatolian territories, it could outlast blockades that might have starved a lesser city. After years of intermittent attacks and winters spent in nearby bases, the Arab efforts faltered. Storms, disease, and difficulties maintaining long supply lines took their toll. According to some accounts, treaties were concluded that acknowledged the limits of the caliphate's reach, at least for a time. Once more, the city had survived. A second major Arab siege in the early 8th century followed a similar pattern of pressure and endurance. Again, there are chronological puzzles and conflicting details in the sources, but the broad picture remains. A determined external power stretched across vast territories, trying to bring down the one fortress that remained out of reach, and failing to do so. Each failure did something subtle but powerful to Constantinople's image. Across the Christian world, tales spread of how the Queen of Cities had withstood great empires, Persians, Avars, Arabs. Sermons and chronicles interpreted this not only as the result of clever strategy or fortunate weather, but as confirmation of divine favour. The Virgin's mantle, icons, relics and prayers were woven into explanations of why fires died down, why storms wrecked enemy ships, why in the end the walls still stood. Among Muslim chroniclers, the tone could be different, but no less striking. Constantinople appeared as the ultimate stronghold of the Romans, a goal both admired and elusive. Traditions circulated that spoke of its eventual conquest as a mark of distinction. Later scholars have debated how central these sayings were in early Islamic thought, and how much they were emphasized in later centuries. But the pattern is clear enough. Failing to take Constantinople did not make it seem less important. It made it loom larger, a kind of unfinished task in the political and religious imagination. For the city's own inhabitants, repeated sieges had complex psychological effects. On the one hand, each survival reinforced a sense of chosenness. To live in Constantinople was to inhabit a space that had stared down enemies from every horizon and endured. Children grew up hearing stories of miraculous deliverance, of emperors riding along the walls, of saints intervening in storms. The walls themselves were not just stone, they were storytellers. On the other hand, the memory of danger never entirely faded. People knew how close hunger had come in some years, how real the threat of betrayal from within could be, how quickly fortunes could shift. The sense of security was always tinged with anxiety. A city that had been besieged once might be besieged again. An enemy that had failed with one strategy might return with another. Yet this very cycle of threat and resistance helped explain why Constantinople remained so coveted. Each failed siege, whether by Avars thundering across the Balkans or Arab fleets anchoring in nearby waters, confirmed that the city was worth the risk. Powers did not invest armies and fleets, treasure and political capital in an ordinary town. They did so because they believed that if, somehow, the walls could be breached, the reward would be transformative. Sieges, then, were not only military episodes. They were public tests of a city's meaning. To the attackers, they were attempts to seize a centre of wealth, faith, and legitimacy. To the defenders, they were ordeals that fused practical ingenuity, walls, ships, incendiaries, with rituals, processions, and prayers. Each contest left scars on the land and in the mind, but each also added another layer to Constantinople's reputation as the city that everyone wanted, but almost no one could take. That reputation, however, came at a cost. To hold such a prize was to live with constant attention, constant rivalry, and over time, growing strains. Behind the proud stories of survival, cracks were beginning to form in the structures that had sustained the empire. For centuries, those cracks were easy to ignore from inside the walls. The city still glittered, ceremonies still unfolded with careful splendour, processions still wound through colonnaded streets, and foreign envoys still stood awed in the great audience hall. It could feel, to someone walking the Macy or praying in Hagia Sophia, as if the empire's old strength remained untouched. But power that looks solid on the surface can be hollow underneath. One of the quietest ways an empire weakens is through its own politics. In Constantinople, the imperial palace was not only a residence, it was a battlefield. Emperors were not always succeeded by their sons in neat, peaceful lines. Generals in distant provinces weighed their chances. Provincial elites felt neglected. Factions within the capital itself nursed grievances. Every crisis of succession, every rumour that a ruler was weak or unjust, could tempt ambitious men to gamble. By the 10th and 11th centuries, such gambles had become more frequent. When a powerful general proclaimed himself emperor, on the eastern frontier, or a faction of aristocratic families pushed forward their preferred candidate, armies might march not against foreign enemies but toward Constantinople itself. The very roads that once carried imperial authority into the provinces became highways for civil war. Each time this happened, the city could feel the tension. Troops were called to the walls, not to fend off steppe riders or Arab fleets, but to prepare for the possibility that another Roman army, men who spoke the same language, wore the same uniforms, might try to force its way in. Within the palace, courtiers calculated which side to support. Outside, merchants wondered whether their livelihoods would survive another round of uncertainty. Civil conflicts did more than unsettle nerves. They drained coin from the treasury, used up supplies, and perhaps most damaging of all, eroded trust. Frontier commanders learned that an emperor might be overthrown before a long campaign could be finished. Local populations saw tax collectors arrive to fund struggles for the throne, rather than to maintain roads or defences. The empire's attention, which had once scanned distant horizons, narrowed and turned inward. At the same time, older support structures were under strain. Byzantium's wealth had always depended on a delicate balance: rich agricultural lands in Anatolia and the Balkans, trade routes linking the Black Sea, the eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, and a tax system that could draw on all of it. When these pieces worked together, Constantine's city could fund fleets, pay soldiers, and fill its markets with grain and luxury goods. But over generations, pressures mounted. As frontier regions were raided or lost to new powers, vast estates in Anatolia passed into the hands of great landowning families. Peasant soldiers, who had once formed a backbone of the imperial army, through local military districts, found it harder to keep their plots. Some sold their land, others were pushed off it. The state's direct control over manpower and revenue slipped bit by bit into private hands. In the west, another slow shift was underway. Maritime cities in Italy, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, had learned to thrive through trade and shipping, and they watched the eastern Mediterranean with keen interest. Byzantine emperors, needing allies and ships, granted these Italian traders extensive privileges, reduced customs duties, special quarters in Constantinople, legal protections. On paper, it was a reasonable bargain. In practice, it meant that foreign merchants increasingly dominated the very trade that had once been the empire's lifeblood. This change could be felt along the Golden Horn. Warehouses and wharves serving Latin traders bustled with activity even when imperial finances were tight. Goods still flowed: silks, spices, grain, furs, but more of the profit leaked outward. Customs revenue shrank at the moment when the empire needed it most. To pay soldiers, to repair walls, to maintain the rhythms of court and church, emperors now had to rely on resources that were no longer as secure. Beyond the horizon of the capital, the map around Constantinople was being redrawn. In the Balkans, new Slavic and Bulgar states had long since settled into the landscape, sometimes hostile, sometimes allied, rarely fully controlled. To the east in the 11th century, Turkish groups pushed into Anatolia, testing the outer defences of the empire's richest provinces. Their victory at Manzikert in 1071, against an imperial army led by Romanos IV Diogenes, did not instantly destroy Byzantium, but it signalled that the balance of power in the east had shifted. As Turkish emirates spread across central and eastern Anatolia, the empire's secure heartland fractured. Towns that had sent tax revenue and recruits to Constantinople now paid tribute elsewhere, or found themselves caught between rival claimants. Caravans that once moved under imperial protection altered their routes. The capital could no longer assume that its hinterland would always answer its call. These pressures intertwined with new religious and political currents coming from the Latin West. When Western European nobles and knights responded to papal calls for crusade at the end of the 11th century, they saw themselves, at least in theory, as heading to protect Eastern Christians and liberate holy sites under Muslim rule. For Constantinople, their arrival was both opportunity and danger. On the one hand, the empire needed help. Armies from France, Germany and Italy could, if properly coordinated, help recover lost territories in Asia Minor. Byzantine emperors met crusader leaders, negotiated oaths, and tried to channel their energy toward shared enemies. Some successes followed. Cities in western Anatolia were retaken, and for a time it seemed that the old Roman power and the new Latin enthusiasm might work side by side. On the other hand, misunderstandings and resentments were never far beneath the surface. Language barriers, religious differences, and long-standing suspicions shaped each encounter. To many crusaders, Constantinople appeared almost impossibly rich and in some eyes insufficiently eager to fight. To many Byzantines, the crusaders looked undisciplined and unpredictable, too ready to seize what they wanted and too quick to suspect betrayal. As later crusades unfolded, these tensions hardened. The empire's weakness became more visible to its supposed allies. Internal struggles within Constantinople, disputed accessions, shifting factions sometimes drew in Latin powers, who found it tempting to back one candidate for the throne over another in return for trade concessions or strategic ports. All of this set the stage for one of the most shocking events in the city's history, the Fourth Crusade. Called at the beginning of the 13th century, this crusade was initially preached as another expedition to the Holy Land. But the realities of debt, politics, and shifting goals diverted it first to the Adriatic, then to the Aegean, and finally to Constantinople itself. What happened next has been retold with horror by both Eastern and Western chroniclers. In 1203, Crusader and Venetian forces anchored outside the city and intervened in a Byzantine dynastic dispute, helping to put a claimant, Alexios IV, on the throne. When he could not meet his financial promises to his new allies, relations soured. In 1204, after a breakdown in negotiations and clashes in the streets, the armies outside the walls turned from uneasy partners into attackers. The assault that followed was unlike the great sieges of earlier centuries. The banners that rose against the Theodosian walls bore crosses, and many of the men who stormed the city saw themselves, however they justified it, as Christian warriors. Yet once the defences gave way, the scenes inside Constantinople resembled the sack of any conquered city. Churches and palaces were looted, sacred objects, icons and relics that had drawn pilgrims from across the Christian world were seized and carried off. Gold and silver ornaments were stripped from altars. Private homes were broken into, libraries scattered, workshops emptied. Fire ran through parts of the city, leaving blackened scars where neighbourhoods once stood. The immediate loss of wealth was enormous, but the deeper wound was symbolic. For centuries, Constantinople had claimed to be the leading city of Christendom, a place set apart, protected and honoured. To be taken and plundered by Latin Christians shattered that image. The mantle of inviolability was torn. Stories that had always ended with miraculous deliverance now had to reckon with an outcome in which the saints had not intervened, or had chosen to do so in ways that could no longer be understood. In the aftermath, a Latin empire was established in Constantinople. A Western ruler sat on the throne of Constantine, while Greek-speaking Byzantine elites fled to successor states in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. These exiled courts claimed to be the true continuation of the empire, and they did, after decades, manage to recapture Constantinople in 1261. The old ceremonies were revived, and the city once again had a Greek-speaking emperor. Yet something fundamental had changed. The restored empire was smaller, poorer, and more fragile. Much of its former territory was gone, in the hands of Latin princes, independent Greek lords, and rising Turkish powers. The city's treasures had been scattered across Western Europe. Its population had shrunk. Its defences, though still formidable, were no longer backed by the same reserves of money, men, and prestige. Most of all, Constantinople's aura of untouchability had been broken in a new way. To outside observers, including ambitious rulers in the Balkans and Anatolia, the lesson of 1204 was clear. The Queen of Cities could fall, not to a massive Eastern empire this time, but to a determined coalition of regional powers, if the empire within the walls was divided and weak. From that point onward, every new threat, every financial crisis, every internal quarrel unfolded under a different sky. The city still stood, its domes and walls still striking against sea and sky, but it did so in a landscape crowded with new rivals, and with the memory of a conquest that had come not from the expected direction, but from those who had once called themselves its brothers in faith. While Constantinople was learning to live with that memory, a new power was slowly growing around it. Across the Bosporus and deep into Anatolia, Turkish principalities rose and fell in the centuries after Manzikert. Among them, one began almost modestly, on the frontier between collapsing Seljuk authority and Byzantine lands. It was led by a dynasty that at first no one would have guessed would reshape the map, the House of Osman. In the 14th century, this small beylik expanded step by step. Villages and market towns were absorbed. Fortresses changed hands. Raids probed deeper into Byzantine territory. Sometimes the Ottomans advanced openly with armies and banners. Sometimes they moved in more quietly, by treaty, marriage alliance, or promises of protection to local elites. They operated in a world where loyalties were not always permanent, where Greek-speaking, Turkish-speaking, Christian, and Muslim communities lived interlaced across the same hills and river valleys. As the decades passed, the pattern became clearer. What had been a frontier principality evolved into a regional power. The Ottomans took key cities in northwestern Anatolia, then crucially crossed the narrow waters into Europe. They established themselves in Thrace, the very region that had once been the empire's secure backyard. Adrianople, Edirne, became one of their major centres. Slowly, the circle tightened around Constantinople. Inside the walls, emperors watched these developments with a mixture of alarm and weary familiarity. They had seen rising powers before. They had outlasted Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and many others. Alliances were made with one Turkish ruler against another, with Latin states in the Aegean, with distant Western kings and popes. For a time, such diplomacy could still keep space open around the city. Yet each generation of Ottoman rulers inherited not only land, but ambition. The idea of a capital on the Bosporus commanding both Europe and Asia was as compelling to them as it had been to Constantine. Constantinople was not just another target, it was the missing keystone in an arch of territories stretching from the Danube to central Anatolia. To rule from elsewhere, while that great walled city remained in other hands at the heart of their realm, would always feel incomplete. Ottoman leaders understood this on a practical level. As long as Constantinople stood independent, it could serve as a base for rivals, a door through which hostile fleets might enter the straits, a symbol that another older empire still claimed universal authority. But there was also a more intangible pull. To take the city that had been the seat of the Roman emperors, the centre of the Christian East, was to lay claim to a different kind of legitimacy. Chronicles from the period suggest that prophecy, prestige, and the language of destiny clung to the city's name in Ottoman circles as powerfully as they did in Christian ones. By the early 15th century, the Byzantine state had shrunk to a handful of territories scattered across the map. A patchwork in the Peloponnese, a few coastal holdings, some islands, and the city itself with its immediate hinterland. Great stretches of land that once answered to Constantinople now paid taxes to Ottoman officials. The Theodosian walls still towered, but beyond them the world was altered. Several Ottoman sultans tested those walls and then stepped back. Sieges were begun and abandoned. Tribute was exacted, and the city was at times treated almost like a vassal. Agreements were struck. Truces were observed and broken. In these pauses, some in Constantinople may have hoped that the old pattern would continue. The empire weakened, but never quite destroyed, woven into the politics of larger powers, yet somehow still itself. Then in 1451, a young ruler came to the Ottoman throne, Mehmed II. He had spent part of his life as a prince, under the shadow of the city's silhouette. He had been educated by scholars who knew both Islamic traditions and the histories of Alexander and the Caesars. The ideal of a world-spanning capital was not abstract to him. When he looked across the strait toward Constantinople, he did not only see a stubborn neighbour, he saw his future seat. From the beginning of his reign, Mehmed's actions suggested preparation. He secured his position within the empire through careful moves at court. He made peace temporarily with potential rivals, so that when he turned his full attention to the city on the Bosporus, he would not need to watch his back. He invested in something new for that landscape, powerful artillery. Gunpowder weapons had been appearing on battlefields across Eurasia for decades, in many different forms. Bombards and cannons were still imperfect tools, dangerous to operators, slow to move, prone to cracking. Yet in certain circumstances, they could change what was possible. Mehmed sought out specialists, including, according to several accounts, a master founder who had previously offered his services to the Byzantines. He ordered great guns cast, their bronze barrels capable, at least in theory, of hurling stone balls massive enough to batter even ancient masonry. At the same time, he looked to the water. Previous sieges of Constantinople had often been defeated not only by the land walls, but by the city's control of the sea, the great chain that could be stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the sheltered harbour for allied fleets, and the difficulty of coordinating land and naval assaults had together saved the city more than once. Mehmed began building a fortress on the Bosporus, Rumeli Hisara, opposite an earlier Ottoman stronghold on the Asian shore. Together, these fortresses narrowed the strait, allowing him to watch and, if necessary, choke shipping to and from the city. By 1453, the stage was set. Constantinople was ruled by Constantine XI Palaiologos, an emperor with courage and a strong sense of duty, but ruling a state with thin resources. Appeals for substantial aid from the Latin West brought promises, a few ships, some brave volunteers from Genoa and elsewhere, but not the kind of massive relieving army that had come in earlier centuries. The city's defenders were a mix of Byzantines, Italian allies, and others, numbering in the thousands rather than tens of thousands. Outside the land walls, Mehmed brought a much larger army. Chroniclers give varying figures, often coloured by emotion or rhetorical flourish, but it is generally believed that his forces significantly outnumbered the defenders. Camps spread across the plain west of the Theodosian walls. Siege lines were dug. Artillery positions were prepared. When the bombardment began, it added a new sound to an old story. For a millennium, the land walls had endured rams, towers, fire, and every device of earlier warfare. Now, over weeks, great stone balls slammed into towers and curtain walls. Some shots shattered on impact, Others tore out chunks of masonry. The defenders responded as they always had, repairing by night what had been damaged by day, filling gaps with earth and timber, rushing men to threatened sectors, trusting in the depth of the defences and the endurance of those upon them. On the water, the struggle was equally tense. The chain across the Golden Horn initially held, and the city's small fleet, reinforced by a few western ships, tried to make its presence felt. At one point, a handful of Christian vessels forced their way through Ottoman attempts to block them and reach the harbour, a brief success that lifted spirits within the walls and angered Mehmed. His response showed a different kind of siege craft. Rather than accept that the harbour was out of reach, he ordered ships to be dragged overland, across the hills behind Galata on greased timbers. It was a difficult, almost improbable manoeuvre, but it succeeded. Ottoman vessels appeared inside the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain. Now, Constantinople's defenders faced pressure from both land and sea. The once secure inner harbour had become another front. Leadership on both sides mattered. Constantine XI moved along the walls, encouraging soldiers, coordinating with foreign captains, taking personal risks. Accounts from the time, though shaped by later memory and legend, often emphasize his determination to stand with the city to the end. Mehmed, for his part, directed operations closely, adjusting tactics, pressing his commanders, and keeping the army focused during weeks of hard work, setbacks, and casualties. As April turned into May, the siege became a test not only of stone and iron, but of endurance. Supplies within the city were limited. The hope of a large relief army arriving from the west grew faint. Outside, Mehmed could bring in more men, more material, more food. Time which in earlier centuries had often favoured the defenders of Constantinople now leaned toward the besiegers. The final assault in late May came after weeks of battering and probing. Again, sources differ on details, and memory has turned some moments into near myth. What seems likely is that multiple waves attacked the walls, some repulsed with heavy losses, others exploiting sections where artillery and previous fighting had weakened defences. At a crucial point, a gate area that may have been imperfectly secured became a breach. Ottoman troops forced their way inside. Once a foothold within the walls was established and could not be dislodged, the defence unravelled. Constantine XI is said to have thrown aside imperial insignia and fought as a common soldier, disappearing into the chaos of the final struggle. Whether every detail of that image is strictly accurate or not, it captured how many, in later generations, understood the end of the Byzantine line. Not in surrender, but in the crush of hand-to-hand combat at the walls that had defined the city's existence. When the fighting ended, the Ottomans held Constantinople. As in many conquests of the era, there was looting, fear, and the harsh realities of victory. Yet Mehmed's actions in the days that followed also pointed toward the future he imagined. He entered the city not simply as a destroyer, but as a ruler claiming his new capital. Hagia Sophia, long the greatest church of the empire, was converted into a mosque. Measures were taken to bring back population, to restore markets, to reshape the city into the heart of an Islamic empire without erasing all traces of its past. Historians have long debated what, exactly, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 meant. Some have called it the end of the Middle Ages, the closing of a long chapter that began with Rome itself. Others see it as one moment, profound, but still one among many, in a broader series of shifts in trade, warfare, and power that had been unfolding for centuries. It certainly did not end Christianity, nor did it instantly transform all of Europe or the Near East. What it did do, quite visibly, was rearrange perceptions. A city that had once seemed almost immune to final defeat, that had survived sieges, plagues, civil wars, and crusaders, was now part of a new empire. The Ottomans could present themselves as heirs not only to earlier Muslim states, but to the Roman imperial tradition, centred on the Bosporus. Western European powers, seeing the straits under new control, began seeking different routes to distant markets, adding further momentum to exploration by sea. The conquest of Constantinople became a turning point not just because of what was lost, but because of what it allowed and symbolized. 1,000 years of Byzantine history did not vanish in a single day, but its political framework did. In its place rose an Ottoman capital that would, in time, be known by another name, yet still sit astride the same waters, under the same sky, drawing the gaze of rulers and travellers from every direction. Empires rise and fall, generals come and go, but across all those changing centuries, Constantinople kept drawing them in. To understand why, it helps to see the city not just as a collection of streets and buildings, but as a knot where many strands of the world were tied together. Untie that knot, and you did not only gain land, you took hold of the strings that ran through it. First there was the geography, the simple, stubborn fact of where the city stood. On a peninsula between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, at the narrow meeting place of the Bosporus, where the waters of the Black Sea squeezed toward the Mediterranean. Behind it lay the routes to the Danube and the plains of Eastern Europe. In front of it, the sea roads that linked the Aegean to the Levant and, beyond, to Egypt and the wider world. Whoever held Constantinople could watch ships pass from one half of Eurasia to the other. They could tax that movement, encourage it, or strangle it. It was a toll gate, a customs house, and a lookout post all at once. For merchants, the straits were a lifeline. For rulers, they were something more, a lever, a hand resting on the throat of trade. That alone would have made the city prized. Yet Constantinople was not simply a convenient harbour. It was also a reservoir of wealth built over centuries of accumulation. Grain from the Black Sea coasts, furs and wax from the north, silk and spices from distant caravans, these all passed through its markets. Artisans in its neighbourhoods produced fine textiles, intricate metalwork, icons, books. Even in times of decline, the habits and networks of commerce were slow to disappear. Around its harbours lay warehouses and docks. Around its great squares stood palaces and churches layered with marble, mosaics and gold. Raiders might dream of that treasure in straightforward terms: plunder, ransoms, the quick rewards of a successful assault. But ambitious rulers saw something else. They saw tax rolls, workshops, skilled labour, and the invisible web of obligations that tied provincial elites and distant communities to the city at the centre. With that came military value. The very features that made Constantinople a trade crossroads also made it a fortress anchoring frontiers. To the west, it guarded approaches from the Balkans. To the east, it faced Anatolia and the lands leading, eventually, to Mesopotamia and Iran. A power ruling from beyond either side could never feel entirely secure, while another rival occupied that hardened point at the junction. The city's walls made this even sharper. They were not only passive defences, they were a statement. The Theodosian walls, with their layered lines and towers, had turned away so many sieges that they acquired a reputation of their own. Armies shattered themselves against them. Chroniclers described them with a mixture of awe and resignation. When later conquerors approached, they were not only challenging the people within, but testing themselves against the legend of those fortifications. If you were a ruler on the rise and you believed that your state was destined not just to exist, but to command, Constantinople became the ultimate measure. To take the city was to prove your army's strength, your engineers' skill, your own courage and persistence. Victory there answered questions that diplomacy and small battles could not. Yet even this is only part of the story. The real magnetism of Constantinople lay in something more elusive, its place in the imagination. From late antiquity onward, Constantinople was never just the capital of an empire, it was the new Rome. It claimed through law, ceremony and architecture to be the heir to the old city on the Tiber. Emperors there wrapped themselves in Roman titles, sat in Roman-style councils, issued edicts in the name of a universal order. They presided over processions that stitched the streets themselves into a kind of moving theatre of empire. For Christian believers, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, the city also became a spiritual beacon. The Patriarch of Constantinople was one of the leading figures of the church. Great councils had met there. Relics were housed in its churches. Hagia Sophia, with its vast dome and ringing chants, became a symbol of heavenly order mirrored on earth. To hold Constantinople was for many to hold the centre of the Christian East. Over time, this combination of Roman law, imperial ritual, and Christian devotion gave the city a unique aura. Legitimacy seemed to flow from its streets. A claimant who could be crowned there, blessed by its clergy, seated on its ancient throne, was not merely another strong man. He could present himself as the rightful successor to centuries of rule. This was true even when the empire's territorial reach had shrunk. Foreign princes married into Byzantine families to borrow a share of that prestige. Western Crusader leaders, when they seized the city in 1204, did not try to destroy its imperial image. They tried to wear it. They called themselves emperors in Constantinople, hoping that the old titles would make their new regime seem more than improvised. Likewise, when the Ottoman sultans looked across the water, they saw more than stone walls and markets. They saw an empty seat waiting to be claimed. By taking Constantinople and ruling from it, Mehmed II could argue that he had stepped into the line of the Caesars. In some of his documents, he even used titles that echoed Roman traditions. In his realm, the city became Constantinia, the seat of the Sultan who now spoke for an empire stretching across continents. So Constantinople represented territory, yes, but also continuity. Whoever controlled it could say, with some plausibility, that the story of empire on those straits had not ended, only changed hands. In ages when people cared deeply about such claims, about the right to rule, about sacred history, about prophecies and signs, that mattered enormously. And the city's meaning did not remain fixed. In the early centuries, it was a forward capital facing old Persia and new Arab caliphates, a shield for the Eastern Mediterranean. Later, it became the embattled heart of a Christian empire, wedged between Latin West and Islamic East. After 1453, under Ottoman rule, it slowly shifted again, into a centre of Islamic scholarship and law, a place of mosques and madrasas, Sufi lodges and courts, layered over an older topography of churches and forums. In each period, different aspects of Constantinople came to the foreground. For some, it was the city of councils and saints. For others, the port through which Black Sea grain fed distant cities. For still others, the prize fortress that could not be left in enemy hands. Yet the underlying pattern persisted. People projected their hopes and fears onto it. They attached stories to its stones. Those stories had a life of their own. Tales of angelic guardians on the walls, of hidden gates that would open only at the end of days, of emperors who would return. These circulated among Christians, even after the city had fallen. In Ottoman lands, too, legends grew, of how the conquest had fulfilled old prophecies of how holding the city proved divine favour. Travellers from Venice, Russia, Arabia, and beyond arrived with their own expectations, their own inherited images of what Constantinople, or increasingly Istanbul, meant. Myth and memory swelled the city's reputation beyond its immediate material value. Long after trade routes shifted, long after new naval powers dominated the oceans, the idea of Constantinople still carried weight. Maps in distant courts marked it with special symbols. Writings spoke of it with a particular gravity, as if to say, here is not just another dot on the shore, but a hinge between worlds. Even its name changed slowly, layered rather than erased. Greek speakers had long referred to journeys into the city as ten polin, a phrase that, over time and through many tongues, softened into the word Istanbul. Under that name, it remained what it had always been, the main city, the place that did not need further description. So when we ask why everyone wanted Constantinople, the answer is not a single reason, but a stack of them, pressed together over more than 1,000 years. Geography placed it at a crossroads. Wealth pooled in its markets, walls made it formidable, religion made it holy, ceremony made it imperial, memory made it larger than life. By the time Mehmed II rode through its gates, the city had already lived many lives and worn many meanings. His conquest did not end that process, it continued it. Constantinople became Istanbul, an Ottoman capital, then, in much later centuries, the beating heart of a modern Turkish republic's most famous city. But the old impulses remained visible under new forms. Rulers still sought it as a stage for their power. Traders still threaded its harbours. Pilgrims, tourists, and dreamers still arrived carrying stories in their minds. The city that once seemed to embody empire itself outlived the empires that claimed it, and in doing so, quietly proved one last thing, that its greatest strength was not only in stone or gold, but in the enduring human desire to stand, just once, at the centre of where so many paths cross. If we step back and let the long centuries settle in our minds like dust, a pattern begins to show through. Constantinople was wanted again and again, because it brought together three kinds of power that rarely live in the same place. The power of position, the power of wealth, and the power of meaning. Its position made it unavoidable. You could sail around many coasts, choose other ports, draw new borders on a map. But if you wanted to move large armies, grain fleets, or caravans between the worlds of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between Europe and Asia, that narrow throat of water kept appearing in your calculations. It was the point you could not quite work around. Hold the point, and you could shape the traffic that brushed past it. Lose it, and you lived at the mercy of someone else's decisions. On top of that came its accumulated riches. Not just coins in treasuries or gold on domes, but the steady, patient wealth of habits, merchants who knew the fair prices and trusted partners of the city, artisans whose skills were hard to replicate elsewhere, institutions that collected taxes and distributed grain. Those habits survived wars, fires, and changes of dynasty. To take Constantinople was to inherit a machine that had been running, in one form or another, since the days when Latin was the language of law, and senators still remembered the old Rome. And then there was what the city meant in the minds of those who looked toward it. For Romans and Byzantines it was the new capital that had saved an empire from the storms of late antiquity. For medieval Christians it was the bulwark of the faith, crowned by Hagia Sophia's great dome. For Ottoman rulers it was the prophesied city whose capture signalled divine favour and imperial destiny. Each age layered its own hopes and fears onto the same streets and harbours. This meant that conquering Constantinople was never only a military act, it was a statement. A new ruler stepping through its gates was not just gaining warehouses and walls, they were stepping into an old story, trying on an old title: Emperor, Basilius, Sultan of Rum, Protector of the Faith. The words changed, but the ambition behind them had a familiar shape. In that sense, the city became a mirror. When crusaders, czars, sultans, or modern nation builders looked at it, they often saw not only its towers and waters, but a reflection of what they wanted to be. Heirs of Rome, guardians of a true religion, masters of a crossroads where continents touched. Yet for all their plans, the city went on. Empires that once seemed permanent faded or shattered. New flags rose over the same promontories, languages on the streets shifted slowly, like tides, but the peninsula remained where it had always been. The Bosporus still funneled ships past its shores, and people still gathered there to trade, to pray, to argue, to dream. It is tempting to say that geography alone explains this persistence, that the rocks and waters forced history into a narrow channel. But geography does not choose who will fight for a place, or which stories will be told about it. That is the work of human minds, of fear and faith and desire. Constantinople's fate was shaped where those two forces met, where a stubborn piece of earth drew in the restless ambitions of those who passed. If you listen to the city now, as Istanbul, you can still hear faint echoes of all those earlier lives. Latin and Greek, Ottoman Turkish and Arabic, prayers in churches and mosques, the creak of ships and the murmur of merchants. They are like overlapping voices in a long conversation that has never quite ended. Perhaps that is why its story feels so strangely calming, even with all its wars and sieges. It reminds us that individual empires, however proud, are brief. Stones endure, waters flow, human beings arrive, claim, rename and depart, leaving behind only traces. As you drift towards sleep, you might picture that narrow strait at night, the city lights resting where once only watchfires burned, and imagine how many different eyes have watched those same waters, thinking their own thoughts of conquest, of safety, of home. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey through Constantinople's long history, you are warmly invited to support the channel. A gentle tap on like, a calm click on subscribe, and a few quiet words in the comments help these stories continue. If you feel like sharing, let me know where in the world you are listening from and how the story of this city reached you tonight. Then, when you're ready, you can let the empires fade and let the city at the crossroads keep its silent watch a little longer without you.